You've become a relic with a title we can't afford anymore. The words from Dr. Elliot Wilson's all-staff email burned on my computer screen, a digital scar seared into my retinas. My hands trembled as I reread the announcement that had been sent to over 300 hospital employees, from the janitorial staff to the chief of surgery. The notification was couched in the cold, impersonal language of corporate restructuring, a dialect I had become fluent in over my 18 years at Northwood Memorial Hospital. After careful consideration of our financial outlook, I've made the difficult decision to eliminate several administrative positions. This includes the role of Senior Hospital Administrator, currently held by Marissa Shaw. The cursor blinked mockingly at the end of the sentence, a tiny, indifferent metronome marking the end of my career. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. 18 years. I had dedicated my entire adult life to this institution, working my way up from an entry-level position in patient records to the second-highest administrative role in the hospital. I had weathered budget cuts that felt like amputations, navigated staffing crises that would have sunk lesser institutions, and stood as a pillar of stability through 3 major transitions in leadership. But nothing had prepared me for this public execution. The email continued, a masterclass in corporate doublespeak and passive-aggressive character assassination. While we appreciate her 18 years of service, Northwood Memorial needs fresh perspectives to navigate today's healthcare challenges. Gina is stuck in the past, resistant to innovation, and preventing us from implementing necessary changes. Gina. My name wasn't even spelled correctly. My name is Marissa Shaw. I'd never been Gina to anyone. The carelessness of it was almost as insulting as the content. It was a clear message. You are so insignificant that I can't even be bothered to learn your name. The personal attack, woven into a formal announcement, was completely and utterly unprofessional. But then again, so was Dr. Wilson. I sat back in my chair, the pleather groaning in protest. My office, a space that had been my sanctuary for over a decade, suddenly felt alien. The framed photos on my credenza, my 2 smiling children, my late husband, our golden retriever, seemed to belong to another woman's life. The row of meticulously organized binders on my shelf, their spines labeled with years of safety protocols, incident reports, and budget analyses, felt like relics of a forgotten era. My era. The irony was a bitter pill in my throat. The woman who had championed patient safety above all else, was being painted as an obstacle. I was the one who fought for better nurse-to-patient ratios when the board wanted to slash costs. I was the one who meticulously documented every near miss, every equipment malfunction, every protocol violation, not to assign blame, but to learn, to improve, to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. Those binders, filled with 18 years of my diligence, were my life's work. Dr. Wilson had arrived 6 months ago, a whirlwind of charisma and an impressive, if vaguely worded, resume from a prestigious Chicago hospital. He spoke of synergies and disruptive innovation and optimizing workflows. He had grand promises and an even grander smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. From our first meeting, I sensed a man who saw patients as data points and staff as line items on a spreadsheet. He showed little interest in understanding how our hospital, a cornerstone of the Portland community, actually functioned. He didn't care about the history, the relationships, the human element that made Northwood more than just a building. His first act had been to eliminate free parking for staff, a move that saved a negligible amount of money, but destroyed morale. His second had been to reduce nursing coverage on night shifts, despite my vehement protests and a mountain of data showing the direct correlation between staffing levels and patient outcomes. He dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. We have to be lean, Marissa. We have to be agile. I knew something was coming when he canceled our last 3 weekly meetings, citing urgent board matters. I had tried to corner him in the hallway to discuss a concerning rise in post-operative infections, but he had clapped me on the shoulder, his smile a mask of plastic bonhomie. We'll circle back on that, Marissa. I trust your judgment, but right now, we need to focus on the big picture. The big picture, I had learned, was always the bottom line. A soft knock at my door pulled me from my stunned reverie. It was Vanessa, my assistant for the last 5 years, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and concern. She was a young, fiercely intelligent woman who I'd been mentoring, hoping she would one day take on a larger role in the hospital. Now, her face was pale, and she clutched a tissue in her hand. "Marissa? I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. This is awful. He can, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the air into my constricted lungs. As chief medical director, he has the authority to restructure administration. I looked around my office, at the life I had built within these four walls, and a strange calmness began to settle over me. It was the cold, clear calm that comes after the storm has passed, leaving devastation in its wake. I knew something was coming, I admitted, more to myself than to her. I just didn't think it would be this. Vanessa's eyes welled with tears. He called you Gina, in front of everyone. It's disgusting. I managed a weak, humorless smile. Sometimes, being underestimated is an advantage. I looked at the certificates on the wall, the family photos, and then my gaze fell upon the row of binders. They weren't just paper and ink. They contained 18 years of meticulously documented safety concerns, staffing issues, and policy violations. Some were resolved. Many, especially in the last 6 months, were not. And I had digital copies of everything, backed up in 3 separate locations. "What will you do?" Vanessa asked, her voice filled with a desperate hope. I looked around my office one last time. I stood up and started collecting my personal items, the photos, the small plant on my windowsill, the mug my kids had given me for Mother's Day. I left the binders untouched. When security arrived to escort me out, another of Wilson's predictably humiliating tactics, I was ready. I smiled, a genuine smile this time, took only my personal belongings, and walked out with my head held high, the 2 young, uncomfortable guards trailing behind me like bookends. That evening, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat in my darkened living room, a glass of expensive red wine in my hand, and made a single phone call. The call was to Dorothy Winters, a former board member who had retired last year. She had been my mentor when I first joined Northwood Memorial and had remained a close friend and confidant. "He did what?" Dorothy's voice, usually calm and measured, rose with pure, unadulterated indignation when I told her about the email. I recounted the whole story, the casual cruelty, the public humiliation, the strategic dismantling of the safety protocols I had spent my career building. "That's grounds for a defamation suit, Marissa," she said, the steel in her voice a familiar comfort. "The misspelling of your name alone shows malicious intent. We can bury him." "Maybe," I said, swirling the deep red liquid in my glass. "But that's not the route I want to take. A lawsuit would be about me, about my reputation, about money. It would be a long, drawn-out battle that would drag the hospital's name through the mud, and in the end, it wouldn't change the fundamental problem. This isn't just about me, Dorothy. It's about the hospital. It's about the patients." I explained how Dr. Wilson had been systematically dismantling safety protocols over the past 6 months. I told her how he'd reduced nurse-to-patient ratios on the critical oncology and pediatric floors, how he'd extended shifts for surgical staff beyond what was considered safe, and how equipment maintenance schedules had been stretched to cut costs. "The problem is," I continued, a cold fire beginning to burn in my chest, "he's been clever about it. Each change is presented as temporary or justified by some industry trend he's misinterpreting. The board sees the cost savings but not the risks. They see a charismatic leader turning the financials around." "And I'm guessing you've documented all of this," Dorothy said. It wasn't a question. Every incident, every complaint, every near miss. I've been building these files since I started at Northwood. 3 hospital directors before Wilson have tried cutting corners, and I've always had the evidence to show why it wouldn't work. What I didn't tell Dorothy was how personal this felt. My mother had been a patient at Northwood 20 years ago. A simple, preventable mistake, a missed medication on an understaffed night shift, had led to complications that extended her hospital stay by weeks and left her with permanent health issues. It was that experience, that feeling of helplessness and the burning need to prevent it from happening to anyone else, that had driven me to pursue hospital administration in the first place. Not for power or prestige, but to be the person in the room who fought for the patients, who ensured they received the safe, quality care they deserved. "I sacrificed everything for that hospital," I said quietly, the words tasting like ash. Relationships, starting a family, vacations. I believed I was making a difference. "You were," Dorothy insisted, her voice firm. "And you still can. The question is, what do you want to happen now?" I took another sip of wine, considering my options. I could walk away with a severance package and find another position. I could file a wrongful termination lawsuit. I could retire early, just as Wilson had so cruelly intended. Or I could fight. "I want to protect the patients," I said, my voice finally clear and resolute. "And the staff who are being pushed to their limits. But I need to be strategic about this." "Smart," Dorothy agreed. "Wilson has the board's ear right now, but that can change quickly if the right information comes to light." I glanced at my laptop, thinking of the files I'd been maintaining. Years of documented safety violations, staffing concerns, and policy breaches. Concrete evidence that could not be dismissed as the complaints of a disgruntled former employee. "Give me a few days," I said. "I need to organize my thoughts and my evidence." 3 days after my humiliating dismissal, I sat at my dining room table, surrounded by a sea of paper. I'd spent hours organizing printouts of emails, policy documents, and incident reports into a coherent narrative. The most compelling evidence of safety violations under Dr. Wilson's leadership was laid out in chronological order, a damning timeline of neglect and recklessness. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica Palmer, the night shift charge nurse in the emergency department, a woman whose competence and dedication I admired immensely. "You wouldn't believe what happened last night. 2 nurses called out sick and weren't replaced. We were at dangerous levels all night. A patient with chest pain waited 4 hours to be seen. Wilson says it's the new normal and we need to adapt." I added the text to my growing file. It wasn't just anecdotal evidence anymore. The statistics showed a clear pattern. Incident reports had increased 37% since Wilson took over. Near misses, potential errors caught before they harmed patients, were up 42%. Staff turnover had doubled. My doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I opened it to find Vanessa, standing there with a large takeout bag from my favorite Thai restaurant. "I figured you weren't eating properly," she said, pushing past me into the kitchen. "Also, I have updates." As she unpacked containers of pad thai and green curry, Vanessa filled me in on the chaos at Northwood. "Wilson announced your replacement today. It's his former colleague from Chicago, Thomas Barton. No healthcare administration experience, but apparently a visionary in healthcare economics." I snorted. Translation: he knows how to cut costs regardless of impact. "Exactly," Vanessa nodded. "Oh, and they're implementing a new staffing model next week. Nurses will cover more patients, and they're cutting support staff hours." "Has anyone raised concerns?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Catherine in nursing tried. Wilson told her if she couldn't handle the workload, perhaps she should explore opportunities elsewhere. Catherine Morris had been Northwood's nursing director for 15 years. She was respected, efficient, and uncompromising when it came to patient safety. If Wilson was pushing her out too, the situation was worse than I thought. "What's your plan?" Vanessa asked, studying my expression. "You have that look. The one you get when you're plotting something." I hesitated. Vanessa was loyal, but involving her could put her job at risk. "I'm considering my options," I said carefully. "The most direct route would be going to the board with evidence of unsafe practices, but Wilson has them convinced he's saving the hospital from financial ruin. What about the healthcare authority? Vanessa suggested. An anonymous tip about safety violations would trigger an investigation. I'd considered this, but regulatory investigations moved slowly, and Wilson could cover his tracks. I needed something more immediate, more public. I'm thinking I might need to approach this from multiple angles, I said. The regulators, yes. But also the medical staff who have concerns, the patients who've experienced declining care, and possibly the media. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Going nuclear, huh? Not yet, I replied. But I'm preparing for all possibilities. What I didn't say was how angry I felt. Not just about losing my job, but about the blatant disregard for the safety I'd spent my career protecting. Wilson wasn't just pushing me out. He was undoing years of work that kept patients safe. I thought about the binders in my office, the evidence I'd accumulated, and made a decision. It was time to act. A week after my dismissal, I sat in a quiet corner of a cafe 3 blocks from Northwood Memorial, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Across from me sat Dr. Andrew Bennett, chief of surgery and someone I'd worked closely with for over a decade. I shouldn't be meeting with you, he said in a low voice, glancing around nervously. Wilson made it clear that anyone maintaining contact with you would be seen as undermining the new direction. Yet here you are, I observed. Andrew sighed, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. What's happening isn't right, Marissa. Wilson is making decisions that compromise patient care, and nobody seems able to stop him. Tell me what's changed since I left, I said, pulling out a notebook. For the next 30 minutes, Andrew detailed a series of alarming developments. Surgical teams were working double shifts. Critical equipment maintenance had been postponed. Supplies were being rationed to the point where staff were bringing in their own basic items. Most concerning was the new, streamlined patient discharge process, which prioritized freeing up beds over ensuring patients were actually ready to go home. We had 3 readmissions last week because patients were discharged too soon, Andrew reported grimly. One was an elderly woman who went home without proper medication instructions. She was back in the emergency department 12 hours later, much worse than when she left. Are people documenting these incidents? I asked. Andrew nodded. We're trying, but Wilson's appointed administrators either minimize the concerns or lose the paperwork. Catherine's been keeping her own records, but she's walking on thin ice already. I slid a USB drive across the table. I need you to give this to Catherine. Anonymously. It contains templates for documenting unsafe conditions in a way that can stand up to regulatory scrutiny. Andrew pocketed the drive. What are you planning, Marissa? I'm gathering evidence for the healthcare authority, I admitted. But I need current documentation that corroborates the patterns I've been tracking. You know this could end careers, right? He said, his eyes serious. Including yours and mine. I met his gaze steadily. What about the patients whose lives we're supposed to be protecting? How many of them will suffer because we were too afraid to act? Andrew looked down at his coffee. You're right. It's just intimidating. Wilson has the board wrapped around his finger. He's promising financial miracles. Financial miracles usually come at a cost, I pointed out. In this case, patient safety. I'll help, Andrew decided. But be careful. Wilson's more connected than you think. His brother-in-law is on the Hospital Association board, and he's got friends at the state level. That was information I hadn't known, and it complicated matters. If Wilson had allies in regulatory bodies, my complaints might be buried or dismissed. As we parted ways, Andrew caught my arm. There's something else you should know. Wilson's been telling people you were fired for incompetence, that you mismanaged budgets and falsified staffing reports. He paused, his expression grim. He's essentially blaming the hospital's financial problems on you. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Not only had I been humiliated and pushed out, but now my professional reputation, built over 18 years of dedicated service, was being systematically destroyed. Thanks for telling me, I managed, struggling to keep my voice steady. Walking back to my car, I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd experienced before. Wilson wasn't just endangering patients, he was attacking my integrity, my life's work. The gloves needed to come off. When I reached my car, I made a decision. It was time to involve someone I'd been hesitant to contact. James Lloyd, an investigative reporter for the Portland Tribune who had covered healthcare issues for years. He'd reached out to me years ago about a story on hospital administration, and I had declined to comment. I found his card in my contacts and sent a text. "We should talk. I have information about patient safety risks at Northwood Memorial." His response came almost immediately. "Been waiting for this call. When and where?" James Lloyd was younger than I expected, probably in his early 30s, with intense eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. We met at a park far from the hospital, where I laid out my concerns about Northwood under Wilson's leadership. "I've heard rumors," James admitted, recording our conversation with my permission. "Staffing complaints, unusual turnover rates. But without someone on the inside, it's hard to verify." "I've got more than rumors," I said, handing him a folder. "These are redacted copies of incident reports from the past 6 months. They show a clear pattern of increased safety risks correlating directly with Wilson's policy changes." James flipped through the documents, his expression growing more serious with each page. "This is concerning, but Wilson could argue these are isolated incidents or the result of system-wide healthcare challenges. That's why I've also compiled these." I pulled out a second folder containing statistical analyses. These show that while similar hospitals in our region maintained consistent safety metrics, Northwood's have declined dramatically since Wilson's arrival. James whistled softly. "You really did your homework." 18 years of homework, I corrected. "I've been tracking these patterns through multiple administrations. The difference is that previous directors listened when presented with evidence. Wilson fired me instead." "Why go public now? Why not take this directly to the board?" It was a fair question, and one I'd asked myself repeatedly. The board hired Wilson specifically to cut costs. They're seeing the financial improvements without understanding the safety trade-offs. And Wilson has convinced them I'm incompetent and bitter. James nodded slowly. "So you need public pressure to force their hand." "Exactly. Once patients and the community understand what's happening, the board will have to act, regardless of Wilson's connections." "This is a solid story," James said. "But you should know what you're getting into. Wilson won't take this lying down. He'll attack your credibility, your motives." "He's already doing that," I pointed out. "At least this way, the truth gets told." As James packed up the documents, promising to verify my claims independently, I felt an unexpected twist of doubt. Was I doing this for the right reasons? Was it about patient safety, or was it about my wounded pride? The answer came to me as James asked one final question. "What's your best-case outcome from this?" Without hesitation, I replied that Northwood returns to prioritizing safe, quality care over cost-cutting. Whether I'm part of that future or not is secondary. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Dorothy. "Wilson's making moves," she said, without preamble. "He's been calling board members individually, telling them you're planning to sue the hospital for wrongful termination. He says you're fabricating safety concerns to strengthen your case." My stomach dropped. "That's not true. I have no plans to sue." "I know that, but they don't. He's poisoning the well before you can even approach them." This was a development I hadn't anticipated. Wilson was more strategically minded than I'd given him credit for. "There's more," Dorothy continued. "He's expediting his cost-cutting plans, implementing them all at once rather than gradually. It's like he knows a storm is coming and wants to secure as many changes as possible." That meant he suspected I was gathering evidence. Perhaps he'd been warned about my meeting with James. Or maybe Andrew's conversation with Catherine had been discovered. "What should I do?" I asked, suddenly feeling out of my depth. "Stay the course," Dorothy advised. but be prepared for things to get ugly. Wilson's the type who's built his career on never backing down, never admitting mistakes. After we hung up, I sat in my living room, staring at the wall of evidence I'd assembled. I'd planned to move methodically, building my case before making it public. But Wilson was accelerating his timeline, which meant I needed to accelerate mine. I texted James. "How quickly can you run the story?" The headline appeared 3 days later, a bold, damning declaration on the front page of the Portland Tribune's online edition. Patient safety concerns plague Northwood Memorial Hospital, director removed. James had worked quickly, verifying my claims with other staff members and comparing Northwood's safety metrics with state averages. The article didn't name me as the primary source, but it did mention recently terminated administrative staff who had raised concerns. My phone began ringing almost immediately. First was Catherine, the nursing director. "It's a madhouse here," she reported. "Wilson called an emergency meeting for all department heads. He's furious, demanding to know who talked to the press." "Has he addressed any of the safety concerns?" I asked. "Not at all. It's all about controlling the narrative and identifying the traitors. He's threatened termination for anyone found to have spoken to reporters." Next was Andrew, who had a more measured take. "The medical staff are quietly celebrating. Someone finally said what we've all been thinking. The board is in an emergency session right now." The most surprising call came from James himself. "You need to turn on Channel 4 right now." I flipped on the television to see Dr. Wilson standing at a podium, a phalanx of nervous-looking hospital administrators flanking him. His expression was grave as he addressed the cameras. "The allegations printed in this morning's Tribune are categorically false," he stated firmly. "Northwood Memorial maintains the highest standards of patient care. These fabricated concerns appear to stem from a former employee who was terminated for incompetence and has been engaged in a vendetta against this institution." He went on to describe me, not by name but clearly identifiable, as disgruntled, resistant to necessary change, and willing to damage the hospital's reputation out of spite. "We have retained legal counsel," Wilson continued, "and we'll be exploring our options regarding this defamatory article." I muted the television, my heart racing. He was attacking me publicly, questioning my integrity and professionalism. "You've got him running scared," James said over the phone. "But this is just the beginning." "What happens next?" I asked. "Next is when things get interesting." The state healthcare authority contacted me after the article ran. They wanted to see all the documentation. This was faster than I'd expected. Typically, regulatory bodies moved at a glacial pace, but perhaps the public nature of the allegations had forced their hand. "I have copies of everything ready to go," I told him. "But what about Wilson's legal threats?" "Standard intimidation tactics," James dismissed. "The Tribune's lawyers reviewed every word before publication. Everything's factual and properly sourced." I wasn't so easily reassured. Wilson had resources and connections I didn't. While I'd been meticulous in my documentation, I knew how facts could be twisted, how narratives could be shaped to villainize whistleblowers. Later that afternoon, I received an anonymous email from a Northwood email address. It was a single, cryptic line: "Check patient readmission reports for oncology over the last 2 months. Pattern of premature discharges followed by complications." Wilson personally approved new discharge protocols despite multiple objections from oncologists. This was exactly the kind of specific, verifiable information that could strengthen the case against Wilson. I forwarded it to James, who promised to follow up. By evening, news vans were parked outside Northwood. The local healthcare workers union had issued a statement supporting the Tribune's investigation and calling for a full review of the hospital's safety protocols. Patient advocacy groups were demanding answers. What had started as my private collection of documentation had snowballed into a full-blown public reckoning. As I watched the coverage, I felt a strange mix of vindication and anxiety. I'd wanted to protect patients and hold Wilson accountable, but I hadn't anticipated how quickly things would escalate or how personal the attacks would become. This was no longer just about my career. It was about the future of Northwood Memorial and the safety of countless patients. And despite Wilson's counteroffensive, I knew I had one critical advantage. The truth was on my side. 1 week after the Tribune article broke, the Healthcare Authority announced a formal investigation into Northwood Memorial. Inspectors arrived without warning, reviewed records, interviewed staff, and observed operations. Wilson was noticeably absent during their 3-day visit, represented instead by nervous administrators who struggled to answer pointed questions about staffing ratios and safety protocols. I watched from a distance, getting updates from Catherine and Andrew. The investigation itself was vindication, proof that my concerns warranted attention. But I knew Wilson wouldn't go down without a fight. On the 4th day, I received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Crawford, chair of the hospital board, stood on my doorstep, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Crawford," I said, genuinely surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." "May I come in?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder as if worried about being seen. I led him to my living room, where my wall of evidence was still displayed. He stared at it for a long moment before speaking. "The board has received the preliminary findings from the Healthcare Authority," he said gravely. "They're concerning. Significant safety violations, potential regulatory actions, possible fines." He paused. "They specifically cited decisions made under Dr. Wilson's leadership." I waited, sensing there was more. "We've also discovered financial irregularities," he continued. "Consulting fees paid to companies connected to Wilson's family members. Questionable equipment purchases from vendors where he holds interests." This was a revelation I hadn't anticipated. My focus had been entirely on safety violations, not financial impropriety. "The board has called an emergency session for tomorrow," Crawford said. "Wilson has been placed on administrative leave, pending a full review." He looked at me directly. "We'd like you to attend the meeting to discuss next steps." I'd imagined many outcomes when I began this process, but reinstatement had never been one of them. I'd assumed my career at Northwood was over, regardless of how things played out with Wilson. "Are you asking me to return?" I clarified. Crawford nodded. "The board recognizes we made a serious error in judgment, both in hiring Wilson and in allowing your termination. Your knowledge of the hospital's operations is exactly what we need right now." The board meeting was tense, with members clearly divided on how to proceed. Some, including Crawford, acknowledged the errors in judgment regarding Wilson. Others were still defensive, suggesting the problems had been exaggerated. Wilson himself was absent, represented by an attorney who made vague statements about differences in management philosophy and misunderstandings about policy changes. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out not just the safety concerns, but my vision for addressing them, reinstating proper nurse-to-patient ratios, resuming regular equipment maintenance, and implementing a system of checks and balances to prevent future compromises to patient care. "These aren't radical suggestions," I emphasized. "They're standard practices that Northwood successfully maintained for years before recent changes." "Yes, they have costs," I acknowledged, preempting the inevitable objection. "But so do readmissions, complications, and regulatory fines." The debate continued for hours, but by the meeting's end, the board had reached several decisions. First, Dr. Wilson's employment was terminated, effective immediately. Second, I would be reinstated as senior hospital administrator, with an expanded role overseeing safety compliance. Third, an independent audit would review all policy changes implemented in the past 6 months, with immediate reversal of any that compromised patient care. As the meeting concluded, James Lloyd's story hit the online edition of the Tribune. Healthcare Authority confirms safety violations at Northwood. Director removed. The article detailed not just the safety concerns, but also the financial irregularities discovered during the investigation. Walking out of the boardroom, I felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that patient safety would be restored, relief that my professional reputation had been vindicated, but also a sober awareness of the damaged relationships and trust that that would need rebuilding. Catherine met me in the hallway, a tentative smile on her face. "Welcome back," she said simply. "There's a lot of work to do," I replied. "Yes," she agreed. "But this time, we'll do it right." In the weeks that followed, I led the implementation of systemic changes at Northwood. We returned to appropriate staffing levels, reinstated essential safety protocols, and established transparent reporting systems for safety concerns. The healthcare authority's final report outlined 27 significant violations under Wilson's leadership, resulting in substantial fines, but more importantly, a roadmap for improvement. Wilson, facing professional disgrace and potential legal issues related to financial improprieties, left Portland entirely. I heard he'd taken a position at a private healthcare consultancy in another state, a concerning development, but one outside my control. As for me, I found myself more committed than ever to Northwood's mission. The experience had reminded me why I'd entered healthcare administration in the first place. Not for power or prestige, but to ensure that patients received the safe, quality care they deserved. 1 year after my early retirement and subsequent return, I stood in the hospital lobby, unveiling a new patient safety initiative. Looking at the assembled staff, many of whom had risked their jobs to speak truth about unsafe conditions, I felt a profound gratitude. My meticulous documentation had provided the ammunition, but their courage had made victory possible. We had transformed a potential tragedy into an opportunity for renewal, proving that sometimes the best revenge isn't punishment, but reform.